writes and speaks so brilliantly that every time you open up the newspaper, you say, yes, he's got it, that's right. There aren't too many of those around, unfortunately, in the current world of journalism, which seems to have all swallowed the intoxicating pill of political correctness. I think we could count the really, really cogent, brilliant, wonderful journalists on the fingers of one hand. And we are certainly privileged to have someone who was a Pulitzer Prize winner, who was a University of Chicago grad, and every single word that he writes is incredibly well chosen. So I thank you so much for coming out today. I thank you for supporting the good work of EMET.
Thanks, Bret, it's an honor to have you here, and I think this crowded room indicates how much people respect your work. I have been privileged to read Bret's book. I don't know how many of you have. It is a must-read, and one of the reasons why we felt it was important to give you a copy is for you to really take it home, not put it on the shelf, but please read the book and share it with friends, family, neighbors. It's an important work. One of the major premises of your book, American Retreat, is to make the case for why, in the face of this growing ideology that we're seeing on both sides of the aisle, that America should turn in and become an isolationist, have developed an isolationist foreign policy. And Bret makes the case for why the U.S. must in fact remain the world's policeman. I wanted to know your thoughts on why it's so obvious to the rest of us in this room who read you on a regular basis and who care about the country that it's important for us to remain maintain the Pax Americana. You point out also that in your book that college seniors who are our future policymakers and politicians are graduating. Graduating this year, we're all born at a time when communism had already fallen. 9/11, the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars are forefront of their memory of foreign policy. There's a video that's making the rounds right now, I don't know if you all have seen it, where a picture of Ronald Reagan is presented to students across the University of Maryland campus, and they cannot recognize who Ronald Reagan is. Indoctrination is occurring across our K through 12 college campuses. So, what do you believe what's going to happen with policymakers, future policymakers, that can alter course and for them to realize how important the case is that you make in your book that America remain the world's policeman?
Well, first of all, thank you for the lovely introduction, Sarah, and for the really wonderful work that EMET does. Very nice of you. If there are only a few people you can count on the fingers of your hand, I'd like to be the middle finger. It is one of the things that I do at the Wall Street Journal is I hire our annual crop of young interns, summer interns. About 200 people or so apply. I hire 5 people every year. These are kids typically at Ivy League schools, although I try every year to find someone from a service academy and someone who maybe didn't go to as prestigious a college, but has some journalistic chops and ganas, as we say in Spanish, some willpower. And when I interview them, what is always striking to me is A, how smart they are, and B, how little they know. And this is you have kids with a lot of horsepower upstairs, but they can't connect the dots because they don't know where the dots are in the first place. And this is a real problem with American education. So suddenly you realize, I was born in 1973, I'm not that old, but suddenly you realize that for them, Soviet communism, the great ideological struggles of the 20th century, it's a foreign country. It's a foreign and distantly remembered country. And so their terms of reference are radically different even from mine. And I'm talking about not your University of Maryland students, I'm talking about really the kind of the cream of the American crop. And so that was one of the things that was in my mind as I wrote the book. Now the real reason I wrote this book is I want all of the candidates for president this cycle to read it, and I know at least 5 of them have. Arguably, I don't know, well, one person who's read it may or may not be a candidate, but a number of them have, and all of them certainly have it because I wanted to shape that debate. But it seemed to me it's also important to shape kind of a national debate about what America's role in the world ought to be. And if you grew up in my generation or anyone in this room, it was sort of a given that America had to lead. That America was, as Madeleine Albright of all people put it, the indispensable country, that without us, we would look on a world that was anarchic. And to say we would look on a world that was like the 1930s means something to everyone in this room, right? We know what that world is. If you say, you know, Manchuria, Abyssinia, Sudetenland, you know what these terms mean, right? But not so younger people. All of this is kind of strange to them. It's particularly strange because when you think about American foreign policy in the broader sweep, beyond just the post-1945 world, one of the things you come to appreciate is how deeply embedded the isolationist impulse is in America's thinking about the world. And for a variety of reasons. First, because we have the benefit of these huge oceans on either side that make the rest of the world seem very far away, but also because of an emotional reason, which is to say that anyone who sees America as a country apart sees America either as a liberator nation, right, a country that goes to free the Germans and Japanese and all these things, or, as John Quincy Adams famously said in 1825, an example. He said, you know, America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the liberty of all nations, but the vindicator only of her own. I think I have that quote more or less exactly right. And that is to say, we have to keep our hands away from the muck that is the rest of the world. First, for practical reasons, because no good can ever come of an intervention of the sort that we had in Iraq or we had in Afghanistan, but also because we're bound to become morally compromised in the business of doing this. So what's the point of getting involved? We should mind our own business. We should let the rest of the world sort it out. What are the Europeans doing? What's the UN doing? Let us withdraw. And that has been a very, very powerful temptation. And this book is an argument for saying that the post-World War II dispensation of America as a lead, not only as a superpower, as an economic superpower, but as a world's policeman is a role that it should continue to fulfill today. Now, that's something quite specific to say world's policeman. To say world's policeman is not to say the world's priest. One of the biggest mistakes we made in Iraq is we went into Iraq to make an example of Saddam Hussein, who had been a thorn in our side and in the world's side for 25 years, who was as malevolent a dictator as there could be, who was a genuine security crisis for the world. And we made an example of Saddam Hussein, depending on how you choose, in 3 weeks or in 9 months, when we pulled him out of his spider hole and killed his sons. And then we said, you know what, we're going to do more in Iraq. We're going to make Iraq into an exemplary state. And the difference between making an example of a bad guy like Saddam and trying to transform Iraq into an exemplary state was the difference between a practical and realizable, limited foreign policy goal and a utopian foreign policy goal. And we got into this business of trying to be a utopian, we adopted a utopian freedom agenda vision, and we got ourselves into trouble. So we don't want to be the world's priest. We should not be in the business of saving souls, winning hearts and minds. We do want to be the world's policeman. What police are in the business of doing is maintaining order, first of all, deterring bad guys, shaping patterns of behavior, and only in the third instance, punishing gross violators or violators of certain norms that we establish as norms that need to be maintained. In September of 2013, the president, or August of 2013, I should say earlier, the president had set a bright red line in Syria on the question of the use of chemical weapons. And then that line was flagrantly, I mean, it was violated many times, but then it was flagrantly, openly, vividly violated. And the president did nothing. And it sent a signal that actually this president was all bluff. That the lines he had established for certain patterns of behavior, certain norms that he expected would be maintained, didn't really exist. That America would not, after all, be a policeman. And lo and behold, 6 months after this bright red line is crossed in Syria, Vladimir Putin seizes Crimea. No consequences to that. What happens after that? He essentially invades, he uses proxies to seize eastern Ukraine. No real consequences from that. Suddenly Iran starts seizing capitals throughout the Arab world, starts becoming much more aggressive in its nuclear negotiations. Suddenly the signal is sent that we don't want to be the policemen of the world. And all of a sudden we're living in this new world of disorder. All of you, every day you wake up and God knows what you're going to find in the newspaper. I'm sure all of you have that sense that the pace of disaster is accelerating. And it's accelerating precisely because there is a vivid sense throughout the world that the only country that can stop the Khameneis, the Putins, the Assads of the world doesn't want to stop it. So this is the kind of universe I'm describing, and it's what I'm trying to do, to say, if you don't like the world into which we seem to be going, these are the things you're going to have to do.
Which leads me, it's a good transition into my next question, because many people, and me included, and historians in particular, have discussed current events in the context of historical precedent. And when we are not there to lead, and when world events become chaotic and out of control, bad things can happen. And in your book, you discuss the historical events, particularly between World War I and World War II. And can you talk about your view of where we are today in the context of history repeating itself? And in doing so, if you could also touch on the decimation of our military capability, because that also in particular has me very fearful. I think unlike between World War I and World War II, we were building our military capability, and we're at a point where we're decimating it with many threats facing us. If you could talk about that.
Look, if George W. Bush's foreign policy has a bright historical analog, it's the foreign policy of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson went to war to make the world safe for democracy. Strikingly similar to the freedom agenda that George W. Bush took with him into the Middle East. After World War I, Americans, especially after the experience of Versailles, Americans said, you know what? The game wasn't worth the candle, as the Brits like to say. We lost 100,000 men, for what? So that Britain and France could carve up the Middle East for themselves, they could impose a Carthaginian peace on the Germans, and Americans became sour about the idea of engaging in the world. And so we withdrew, which means that the correct analog for Barack Obama in some ways is Warren Harding. Think about it. Warren Harding was the guy who gave us the word normalcy, right? He wanted normalcy for the United States, which was a return to its prior status as a kind of a country apart, right? Barack Obama wanted nation building at home. And the nation building at home couldn't be more clear that the essential isolationist idea is that foreign and domestic policy exist in tension with one another. That they are, in a sense, a zero-sum game. You want an active foreign policy, that means you're taking away from roads, schools, deficit reduction, whatever your domestic priority is, whether it's a Rand Paul priority or a Barack Obama priority, that's the basic idea. And that was the idea that Warren Harding brought with him. We were going to completely demilitarize, which is what we did after the First World War. We're going to sponsor disarmament conferences. There's a Washington Naval Conference in the early 1920s, very similar to the disarmament ideals of the administration. We're going to focus on our own needs. Let the rest of the world take care of itself, and we'll give speeches talking, wishing the world well and saying we should outlaw war, which in fact we did with the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And we decimated our military. Our military between the wars was a shell. was a shell military. Well, despite what you may have heard from Rand Paul or other people, we are now moving very swiftly to the smallest army we will have ever had since before the beginning of the draft in 1940. We have the smallest navy we've had since the First World War. We have the oldest Air Force we have ever flown. We now have pilots who are flying the same planes that their grandfathers flew because our...
And I'll quote, he said, a misplaced belief in decline was translated into a disastrous recommendation of retreat. How do you differentiate between the two for those of you that have not quite seen the book and don't give away all the secrets, but I mean, is it inevitable that one is going to follow the other?
Napoleon said the logical outcome of retreat is surrender. Retreat, if carried on long enough, becomes self-fulfilling. It starts to move or ignite, if you will, engines of decline. But retreat is not decline. Retreat is a policy choice. At least our retreat right now is a policy choice. It was made by one president, but can be reversed by the next president. Decline happens for reasons that are often beyond the capability of politics to fix. For example, the Europeans and the Japanese have some aversion to procreation, right? They don't procreate enough, right? And so you have modern Western countries whose populations are in steep decline, only partially offset by immigration in various places, right? Now, it would be very hard for any political leader to reverse that. We found that every single effort attempted natalist, natalist policies doesn't really work. You can offer all kinds of free daycare and all that, and it doesn't really do the job. Why is this happening? Well, you know, science, technology, women's empowerment, the decline of religion, a different notion of life. Those are very difficult things to reverse. Now, Russia, by the way, is also a country in economic or in demographic implosion, and yet Russia is not in retreat. Russia is on the march. Russia is seeking to reverse its decline by being a much more aggressive power. America, one of the arguments in this book, is America is a country in retreat, but not in decline. And I think, quite frankly, if 50 years from now, people will look at the current bout of declinist phobia, much as we looked at the bout of declinist phobia in previous decades. I mean, when I grew up, Japan was taking over the world. Now to say Japan is going to be the next great power is a laughable proposition. Today, China is going to take over the world. That's another laughable proposition, and I would be happy to go on at length about the lunacy of thinking that China is going to overtake the United States. You think of what the great innovations in the early 21st century are: fracking, social media, the apps revolution, the revolutions that we're experiencing in, say, cancer treatments that are coming our way. They're all stamped made in the USA. They're not made in China. They're not made in France. They're made here because this country retains a certain resilience and capacity to innovate that doesn't exist anywhere else except one other country. I was going to say Jordan. And so we need to, and that's important because we need to understand that we will be the #1 country for the rest of the century. And because you're the #1 country, that means they're going to be after you. You cannot shrink from if you're going to be the #1 country, you need a foreign policy that is suitable to being the #1 country. I mean, look, if we became Britain, right? And part of the isolationist myth, by the way, is the idea that we can become New Zealand. You know, nice, pleasant country in nobody's way, right? No one has ever in history ever said a negative word, as far as I know, about New Zealand. I mean, I can tell about what the horrors. So we will not have the gift of being inoffensive. And because we don't have that. We have to be realistic about who our enemies are, what they want, and why they want it.
Which really great transitions into my questions. Because one of the very entertaining chapter in Bret's book is the second to last chapter, in which he lays out, to the best of his ability, which I think actually is quite accurate, the world disorder that would occur under a Hillary presidency, since 2016. The various scenarios that are laid out in that chapter are quite pessimistic. But he does end the book with great optimism of a way forward to move. And I think that given the various events over the past couple of months since you published America in Retreat, are you optimistic about things that can be reversed, stability return to the Middle East, North African region, perhaps America, Pax Americana restored? You make the case for the restoration of Pax Americana and our role as the world's policeman. You talk about the broken windows approach, which is very important, I agree, especially as you point out, given what we've seen play out in Baltimore. While I blame Obama for the global disorder that we're seeing, I also blame the American people because they elected Obama twice. And what has me concerned is the American people that elected for the Clinton presidency. And so, if you read Bret's column today, which once again is a must-read, there's some fabulous one-liners, I might add.
Although it's funny, I talked about hollandaise sauce on stage, and numerous readers are like, "What's hollandaise sauce?" I do.
I like the Python following that was great. But you stated, an America that elects Mrs. Clinton as president will do so as a nation of cynics. Is that how we see it? Is that how we see, or what we want for ourselves? So I'm wondering, do you have more faith in the American people than I do, and are you still optimistic since you've written America and figured out a way forward? Is that possible?
Yeah, I always quote Churchill's great line: the American people always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other alternative. and I actually happen to believe that. I do have in this country and its native common sense. And let's remind ourselves that we've elected some doozies in the past, and that we're still, the president directly preceding our greatest president with our very worst president. First of all, so in this ninth chapter, which I imagine the world in 2019, what I try to do is say, okay, the world in 2019 is a big mess. Hillary Clinton's president. She doesn't even know she wants to run for the second term because she's just got such disasters on her hands. How did we get here? And it all begins with a sharp rise in the price of the dollar and a steep decline in the price of oil. I wrote this in February of 2014, so I'm clearly in the wrong business. I should be trading commodities. There's a bet. I have the faith in my convictions. So far, so good. And it's, by the way, it's a funny thing when you write a book called American Retreat, because of the long lead times in publishing. I submitted this manuscript in May of last year, and then it wasn't published until November. You're sitting there thinking, well, what if Obama does something like this could be good for the world, but disastrous with my thesis. So far he's obliged to be commercially, but not going to worry about that. So look, I do worry about the cynicism of a great deal of the American population. It seems to think that our greatest, that first of all, we were never all that great, and even if we were, this is all somehow in some remote past, and we have to accept in America reduced capability, reduced ambition, and reduced idealism. And we have to accept political leaders who don't meet the ordinary tests of probity and trustworthiness that you would expect in anyone coming to work for your law firm, or I would expect anyone coming to work in journalism. We don't want to become a country country that is just so nonchalant about being led by scoundrels. One stripe or another. Now, do I think that we can reverse that? Yes, I do. Is the evidence on my side? we will see. We will see. But as I said, this country, the reason America always surprises everyone else is because the interesting things that are happening in this country are ones we don't really know. I mean, we know the Chinese are now going to build the tallest building, and they're going to have the fastest train, and they've laid all this track, and they've got a brilliant 5-year plan, and the mandarins in Beijing have thought it all out, and they're playing chess, and we're playing checkers, and all of these stupid Tom Friedman-esque cliches are like a lodestar for me, because I just read a Tom Friedman article. Something precisely the opposite, like George Costanza from I will lie that the roughly correct conclusion. Whereas America is always surprising itself because guys you hadn't heard of 5 years ago, things you hadn't heard of 5 years ago, suddenly are all the rage. I mean, 5 years ago, Paul Krugman wrote a column. I just want to say something. Krugman just wrote a column saying, the columnists who have made mistakes in the past and aren't owning up to them, are scoundrels. Krugman writes a column 5 years ago saying, guess what, folks? We're at peak oil, and America's never going to be part of the energy story again. I have yet to read the Krugman column saying, oh gee, the most significant economic and perhaps geopolitical development of the last decade is something I completely and flagrantly missed. He also talked just a few years ago about how Argentina is a great economic success story. He said in 2005 we need to inflate the housing market, and we need a housing bubble to replace the tech bubble. Anyway, sorry. But the point about fracking is interesting. 6 years ago, I would say only 5 of you in this room, if you said the word frack, you think it's a pleasant word for another word that begins with F. You have no idea of what's being spoken about. And yet we are now the world's leading energy and gas producer. Or we're about to become the world's leading oil producer. So the miracle of America is that we are constantly taking ourselves by surprise, and I think we do so.
I feel better now. I'm going to move on to a couple questions about Israel. And you published a column recently. It's called Israel Alone, which reminded me of Mark Stein's book from several years ago, America Alone, in which he analyzed the demographics and touched on a little earlier. And the basis of that is that America has left the city quest for civilization. In your column, you stated...
That Stein wrote after.
Yes.
He became a little more pessimistic.
He did, yeah. After your optimistic response, I was going to avoid talking about that one. But in a sense, you stated in your Israel Alone column, the Israelis haven't yet figured out that what America isn't what America was. They need to start thinking about what comes next. Can you talk about Israel's solitude in the world and the context of America's withdrawal from the region and foreign policy from Germany? And how do you see it?
Look, I think this administration's policy towards Israel is a scandal. And it's a scandal in two senses. It's a moral abdication and a strategic abdication. Look, one of the basic lessons of geopolitics, one of the things that I talk about in this book, is Machiavelli says, a good prince needs to cultivate a reputation as a firm friend and a thorough foe. And he has to declare himself clearly for one and against the other. That is the ABCs of statesmanship. And the mark of this administration is that we have scolded our friends and taunted our enemies. And that's just terrible, terrible statecraft, right? Because we have essentially given common enemies the opportunity to think that they can peel off our weaker allies and do whatever, and that's what they're attempting to do with Israel and the UN, with de-legitimization campaigns, the Hamas, the attacks. So I think that's a reality that Israelis Israelis need to think about this as if it's going to happen, even though I hope in the long term it won't happen and the next president will understand what America's doing. So that's kind of what the article was admonitory, not simply descriptive. It's a moral abdication because, quite frankly, the notion that somehow Benjamin Netanyahu is a borderline rogue leader for saying this, that, and the other, whereas Iran can have a daily death to America, death to Israel, death to the Jews marches, Holocaust revisionism seminars, all of them sponsored by that lovely moderate Rouhani, and this administration barely can make itself issue a State Department level condemnation. It's just morally perverse. America may be a superpower, but we don't have the luxury of dispensing cavalierly with our friends and allies in any region. Certainly not now. Now, that being said, I think Israel needs to sort of remember the lessons of the first 19 years of its history. People say, "Oh, Harry Truman recognized Israel, the first 12 minutes." But the truth is that for the first 19 years of Israel's history, America was a distant and fairly ambivalent ally. Not even ally is the wrong word. Country for Israel. Israel's premier foreign arms supplier was France, actually Czechoslovakia, very, very, very early on. But it was the French, the Israelis, and the French jointly developed the nuclear capabilities. Israel had a policy of trying to ingratiate itself wherever it could, African countries, South Africa, and so on. And it understood, by the way, that Israel's future did not depend on being securely in the bosom of some mother protector country. Israel's security rested in being a country that constantly surprised and constantly knew how to take the initiative and was prepared to take risks when it thought it needed to do so. One of the interesting facts is that Israel's alliance with the United States didn't grow out of the fact that Israel just did whatever America wanted it to do. The Americans had all kinds of plans for the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administration of Israel to make it do the fight. Israel's alliance began, especially after 1967, when the Israelis showed that they could get the business done. And it was respect eventually translating into love, not love translating into respect. I mean, I say this like in relationships. If there's no respect, the love is going to come, right? If there's love to begin with. Right? Respect has to be the basis of how Israel wants to be seen in the world. And this questing for the world's love, by taking risks for peace, by giving this, that, and the other to the Palestinians, by relinquishing the tax controls, by overlooking all kinds of transgressions against it, by doing whatever the administration wants, is a recipe for disaster. In 1967, Israel defied Lyndon Johnson and attacked. What it got was more respect and more support from the United States. In 1973, Golda Meir would not defy the United States. Israel was attacked on Yom Kippur, and what it got was tremendous pressure from the Ford administration. In 1991, Israel succumbed foolishly to pressure from the Bush administration not to respond to the Scud missile attacks. What it got was the harshest administration until this one, when it came to Israel. I mean, where was the gratitude of George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker for getting scudded, invent a term, right, and doing nothing in response? What happened was Shamir got strong-armed and pushed out the door. Right? In 2007, George W. Bush opposed the strike on the reactor in Syria. It overstruck, and Bush's reaction, according to credible sources, is that guy has which means door in Spanish. So Israel should bear that in mind, and that's why I wrote it.
On a similar vein, in addition to the military challenges facing Israel, I see a perfect storm developing that's very dangerous for Israel. The Jews worldwide. I mean, ever since Israel's success in the 67 war, all of a sudden David and Goliath was switched positions for Palestinians. We've got, accusations of apartheid and BDS movements and threats of not sustaining, not exercising our veto power of the UN, and anti-Semitism is growing by leaps and bounds. I think that Obama has furthered this narrative happily. But once he leaves office, is the cat out of the bag, or can be put back in the bag? And do you think that with an administration that was more supportive of Israel, that spoke out against some of the more abhorrent acts against Jews worldwide, and
the landed people instead of
so what do you see as the near future for the Jewish people and views on Islam in general?
Well, a column I wrote a few months ago was called "Packing Time for French Jews," informed by the sense that as an American Jew, I'm alive because some ancestor of mine said we're getting the hell out of Lithuania, Russia, Kishinev, Italy, I don't know what it is for your family, but it's somewhere, right? There's something interesting has happened in terms of how the taboos with racism have become stronger, and the taboos against anti-Semitism have become weaker. And I think there's an explanation for that, which is that after the Civil Rights Movement, after the end of Jim Crow and the Voting Rights Act, Black Americans said, it's not enough that racism ended as a legal matter; it needs to be ended as a cultural matter. And just because the Klan can march in Skokie or something, or just because there's freedom of speech, that doesn't mean that cultural institutions in this country can't be held to account, can't be shamed for sponsoring, supporting, accepting racist behavior, right? So, Michael, I just used a Seinfeld reference. The guy who played Kramer on Seinfeld, Michael Richards, apparently gave some racist rant, and he's been basically kicked out of Hollywood, right? He's excommunicated. I'm sure the guy has buckets of money, and he's going to live out his life very comfortably. And I don't want to say, maybe, he had a bad night or whatever, he was on medication. Whatever the case is, okay, he's out of town. He's not being invited back. And that says something about the cultural tenor of this country in a positive way. People say, taboos are terrible. What are you talking about? Taboos are the difference between civilization and barbarism, okay? No taboos, and it's, harmonious bullshit garden of earthly delights, now, look at the taboo against anti-Semitism, right? We've been, as Jews, finding excuses for bigots for the longest time. Because, anti-Semitism is one thing, that's different from anti-Zionism. I know lots of Jews who are against the Zionist idea. It's wrong to call an anti-Zionist an anti-Semite. We don't want to see ourselves as McCarthyites. We don't want to be in speech or thought police. And, guys like Mearsheimer and Walt write a book, and it's published by Farrar, Straus, Giroux, and they want to basically rehash ancient anti-Semitic canards. The First Amendment, after all, we're the Jewish people, all this crap, right? Instead of people saying, this is disgusting, it's outrageous, these people should not have faculty positions, we are going to oppose them at every turn, I'm not going to give a cent to Harvard, or I hate to say this because I'm UC grad, the University of Chicago school, as long as these jerks are there, basically to say this is totally outrageous, right? You're eroding that taboo. And so now we're kind of stunned that at UCLA, I just was at this AJC meeting yesterday. There was this Christian girl, Lauren Rogers, part of the student council, took a trip to Israel and was therefore, they tried to kick her out of the student council just for taking an AJC-sponsored trip to Israel. And people go, how is this one happening here, right? I mean, every BDS campaign is ipso facto outrage, right? It is disgusting. And we should demand that university presidents say, no, excuse me, but you won't accept
right, the white supremacist equivalent to BDS, okay? You don't even accept Charles Murray on your campus because he wrote the Bell Curve, right? So that's taboo, okay? But claiming that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians is free speech. Politically speaking, I think 2,000 years of exile hampered Jewish understanding of the mechanisms and methods of politics. And we are trying to conduct politics as if it is a subsidiary, as if it is a subsidiary domain of ethics. And it's not, okay? There has to be ethics in politics, but politics is not simply an extension of ethics, right? And we have to understand that there is such a thing as political life where there are all kinds of exigencies that don't fit into our ordinary ethical conventions. I mean, one of the things that I constantly say is if you're the Prime Minister of Israel, whether you like him or not, whether it's Herzog or Bibi or whoever, every Israeli Prime Minister wakes up every day and your menu, you know, someone comes to you, your policy bucket, as it were, comes to you and says, "Sir, would you like the shit option or the really shitty option?" I'll take the shit. Right? Because it's a constant confrontation of the choice of evil. And that's politics at its most realistic and extreme. And it's interesting that a people who were exiled from political life for 2,000 years re-entered it, not simply on some, like, you know, we're going to get used to this politics business slowly, but they were thrown straight into the proverbial deep end. They weren't put into a nice little colony in near Iceland, you know, a province of Iceland. They were put into political life where all the choices were bad, were immediate, were difficult. And it's one of the reasons why it drives me insane to hear diaspora Jews kind of loftily casting aspersions on Bibi, like, well, why doesn't Bibi do the right thing? You know, why doesn't he immediately vacate the West Bank? And you know, is it because he's stupid? Well, he's not stupid, so he must be evil, right? That's the kind of Binartian thinking on politics that is infuriating. It's so arrogant to have these pishers, you know, who are going on about, well, what Israel should do the ethical thing, right? Because it's so comfortable if you're living in an apartment subsidized by Cy Newhouse to lecture the Israelis about what their neighborhood should look like. And to basically give them Rodney King style lectures. I really like letting loose. Well, I mean, it's just this kind of, and the way in which diaspora Jews are doing Israel a disservice, but they're doing diaspora Jewry a disservice as well. And we are going to find my kids who are 11, 9, and 5 are going to find an atmosphere for Jews that I would encounter and could have imagined not all that long ago. And I tremble at what their children are going to find if we just simply carry on as we are and simply think we just have to keep our heads down, don't rock the boat, don't be obnoxious, don't develop a reputation as those stiff-necked people who, you know, insist on this, that, and the other.
I have one final question, then we'll open up to questions from you all. You've taken the position that Iran will not sign a deal when, you know, come June, no matter what it looks like. And I hope to God you're right, but I'm wondering if the $50 million signing bonus has changed your position. I say billion, yes, I know that. $50 billion.
You sound like
no, I have
you sound like that character from Austin Powers.
Thanks for insulting me now also. Peter Beinart's one thing. So, has your position changed at all?
Look, you know, as Niels Bohr, the great Danish physicist, once said, you know, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. Look, I made the I continue to. I understand there are very good reasons why the language is on the deal, because it is an incredibly good thing. It is an utter giveaway by this administration.
sanctions only upon good behavior, never mind. Intrusive inspection, never mind. And yet I think that Khamenei doesn't want to do it. And Khamenei is looking for a pretext not to do it for a couple of reasons. First, ideological, which is that he hates America, and signing any kind of deal that puts any kind of restriction, even if he's going to flout it in practice, on Iran's nuclear capability, he's loath to abide. And we disrespect Khamenei by thinking that he doesn't have at least a certain concept of ethics. He does. It's precisely because he has a concept of ethics that we have a problem with him, right? He's not the Clintons who's like, whatever, just sign the deal, funnel the money to the... So there's an ideological objection. And there's also a practical reason, which is that I think he has our number. I think if I were Khamenei, I would reject it, right? And then we'd have a crisis. Bomb them, and then I would restart the nuclear stuff. I would say, okay, we're out of the joint agreement, we're restarting. Then all of a sudden, the weight of Western opinion is we have to stop Iran, and we don't want to take military action, so we need a deal. At this point, what you've agreed so far becomes the baseline for the next round of concessions, because he understands that we're desperate. I mean, I was in Marrakesh, and I went into a carpet store. God, it was the most beautiful carpet in the world, right? And I bought it for much more than I should have. And I tried to learn from that experience. I'm like, I could have paid 10% of what I paid for this stupid carpet, which my wife didn't even like when I brought it home, right? But the guy had to love that. And we should be wise enough to know that in this bizarre environment, we're not going to win, so don't go into it, okay? We're not that smart. I wish Obama, Democrats love to talk about how Americans need to have more humility. Have the humility of knowing when this is not a game in which you're going to win, okay? We're not going to win the World Cup in soccer, all right? We're not going to out-negotiate you. What we can do is out-intimidate the Iranians by showing that we're serious, that we're not going to let them get a bomb, and that we're prepared to do anything to stop them. And we mean it. That's how you, quote, negotiate with the Iranians. And if a certain level of coercion hasn't done the job, you increase the coercion. You constantly increase the price until the point where you put them to a stark choice. You can have a bomb, or you can have an economy. You can have a bomb, or you can have a regime. You can't have both.